Hi, everyone. Welcome to What's Next for Cash-Based Social Policies, Lessons from the Expanded Child Tax Credit, a live at Urban event being put on for you all today. I've just been pausing a minute to let the attendees trickle in. My name is Mary Bogle. I'm a Principal Research Associate at the Urban Institute, very interested in the subject of cash-based social policies. My lane is mostly to do research on guaranteed income and other cash-based social policies. So I am introducing today, since we're not necessarily going to be talking about guaranteed income, but the other sort of cousin-like policy, which is the child tax credit, and what we can glean from a campaign in Tulsa, and some policy insights into that, especially those that can be best furnished from some of the folks who actually received the child tax credit in Tulsa through the campaign. So let me start out with some housekeeping notes to folks, and then I'll give you a bit more information on the event and turn it over to the presenters. First of all, our event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterwards. So send it out to your colleagues and folks if you find it valuable, and I'm sure you will. Speaker biographies are available online. And I think you'll find that in the chat to link you to the bios. And then all participants are muted, but you can type your questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time. And we are going to have fairly extensive Q&A at the end of the event, and have a lot of time for discussion in the middle. Let's see, the other thing we want you to do is make sure you take 1 to 2 minutes to complete the survey at the end of the event, and also engage with us online at #LiveAtUrban. So let's let folks know in real time about this valuable conversation. So the main thing that I'm here to talk about today is that, let's see, I'm going to switch to, is that the Jain Family Institute and the Urban Institute have been working together to explore insights on the CTC and other options, explore insights on the CTC and other options for cash-based social policy for a number of months now. And our emphasis in these discussions has been on pulling lessons learned from the lived experiences of those most affected by issues concerning employment, safety net, taxes, and other areas of policy relevance. We have informally labeled this collaboration the CASH Consortium. The Financial Security Program at the Aspen Institute has also been very involved in these discussions. Today's event is an example of the kind of content we think can help everyone understand the complex issues attached to cash-based social policy and things like taxes. So what we're going to do is begin with reflections from the Tulsa organizers of an expanded child tax credit outreach campaign in Tulsa, Oklahoma, then move to the perspectives and experiences of child tax credit beneficiaries, a set of parents from Tulsa who actually received the child tax credit via the campaign. The Urban Institute, by the way, has provided research support to campaign sponsors, as well as collected and analyzed the data on the campaign's key strengths and pain points. A follow-up panel of experts will use these insights to reflect on policy takeaways about the child tax credit and to reflect on this and other viable options for getting more cash to American households struggling to make ends meet. So with that, I am going to turn it over to one of the said policy experts who's going to give a little preview on what the child tax credit is and what it means. So Elaine Mogg, take it away.
Thanks so much, Mary. It's been an absolute joy working with Mary these last few months. She's one of those colleagues who's incredibly inspiring. And so as set out today, my task is to sort of explain what we just experienced in the last 7 or 8 months with the child tax credit. It was rather revolutionary change. We did something in the tax system we haven't done before, and it's now on pause, and we don't know what the future is. But whatever the future is, we firmly believe it ought to be based on what will serve the people, the policies intended to affect the best. So the 3 big changes that happened is, first of all, the credit amount was increased. Prior to 2021 and now in 2022, you can receive a maximum of $2,000 per child as part of the child tax credit. In 2021, those amounts were increased to $3,000 for children ages 6 to 17 and $3,600 for children under age 6. The second thing that happened is that the definition of who a child was expanded just a bit. Prior to 2021, you had to be 16 or under to receive the child tax credit. That was increased to age 17 in 2021. And finally, the credit was made fully refundable. And that's the wonky tax way of saying everybody, even very low income families, get it. So I want to talk a little bit about why each of these changes were made. The first is the increase in the credit amount. I think there was some recognition that families were hurting due to the pandemic. But the second thing is that the United States has long struggled with a very stubborn child poverty rate that's higher than most other developed countries. And so there's been a concern amongst many people for a long time that we ought to do something to bring this down. And it worked. Delivering these benefits reduced poverty in a typical year, my colleagues estimate, by about 40%. In any given state, the child poverty level was reduced to below 10%, except for in 3 states. The second piece, making the child tax credit larger for very young children, was also done based on a lot of research. There's substantial evidence that shows when we invest in children when they're very young, we get the biggest bang for our buck. The second is that most children ages 6 and up are in or have access to a free public setting for most of the day. So to provide additional subsidies for younger children sort of pieces those 2 systems together. The next thing that happened is increasing the age to age 17. This is one of those relics in the tax system. There's no legislative reason why the credit was limited to 16 and under. And most likely it was just a function of how much money they had to spend when they developed the child tax credit back in 1997. The definition doesn't make sense. We think of children as under 18, and so this was a way to correct that. The third piece is making the credit fully refundable. Prior to 2021, you had to earn at least $2,500 to receive any credit. And then the credit began to phase in. As you earned more credit. Well, the effect of this policy is that the lowest income children received no or limited credits, and high income families actually received the full benefit of the credit. People concerned with child development would not have designed a policy in that manner. And so this was a way to undo that and extend the full value of the credit to those families who need the most additional income. By doing that, we included over 27 million children who used to receive only a partial credit because their parents' income wasn't high enough. It's a way to focus the credit back on children rather than tying it to activities parents may or may not be participating in. The final thing that happened this past year was that the credit was essentially made monthly. So we used to deliver the credit for low-income families as part of your tax refund. That meant that families receive roughly, low-income families can receive like 15% of their entire annual income at tax time. By delivering the credit throughout the year, we were able to deliver up to $300 per child from July to December. The credits were automatic for many families, but I think what you'll hear today is that they weren't automatic for everyone, and it was a bit of a struggle to get that payment if you weren't already in the tax system. And when I think about that, I think about when we start programs, we have to start from what we have, and the tax system is relatively comprehensive, but we ought to remember that it doesn't meet everyone. So I'm now going to turn this over to my colleague, Faye Walker. She works at the Urban Institute and has been working on a project with the George Kaiser Family Foundation in understanding how the child tax credit played out in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Thanks so much, Faye.
Thanks so much, Elaine. We are now going to be joined by three of the people who are managing that program in Tulsa. So we're going to be joined by Cynthia Hasso from the George Kaiser Family Foundation, Maria Elena Kaikendel from the Community Service Council, and Marcella Swenson from Tulsa Response. Hey folks, thank you all. So we want to start by just kind of getting a sense for the program. Cynthia, could you start by just describing what spurred the Kaiser Family Foundation to start this outreach? What were you hoping for? What were the current concerns that you had specifically in Tulsa?
Yeah, first and foremost, just thank you all so much for joining us in this conversation. We hope that you all can glean as much of what we have learned over the last few months. So I'm going to start just really quickly by sharing what the foundation does and what sort of motivated us and where we are now. So since the inception of the George Kaiser Family Foundation, our mission has been focused on Tulsa's youngest children and really making sure that their families have the opportunity to succeed in life. And so that meant that back in 2017, we started an initiative called Birth Through 8 Strategy for Tulsa. And this was really focused on creating a comprehensive continuum of care that strengthened programs and services from pre-conception to third grade. And so with the network of 40 nonprofit and public agencies as network partners, we identified public benefit access as one of the critical priorities that we needed to pursue as a collective group. And so the child tax credit, SNAP, EIDC, WIC, most recently Medicaid, have all become priorities for BEST, or the Birth Through 8 Strategy for Tulsa. And it was fundamentally important because of access barriers, also the ability to impact and just the scale. And so when we learned about the expanded child tax credit, we knew it was critical to find families, especially those that were hardest to reach, those that were most likely to be disconnected from the social safety net, or those that possibly were fearful of accessing the benefit for a variety of reasons. And so with the help of Urban Institute, we got a lot of data in terms of where we may be in Tulsa with the children who are at risk. And so we found out there were about 4,000 kids in Oklahoma that were at risk of missing out of the child tax credit. And so our goal was really to reach as many folks as we could in a very short period of time, with a lot of drip information coming from the IRS and with some incredible partners. And so we used our existing BEST partner network, worked with Tulsa Response, Power of Families Project with Fabiola and really trusted messengers to get the word out, raise awareness, and provide those technical assistance to families who were not filed previously. And so our hope, again, was both really to raise awareness and to reach those that were hardest to reach. And to be honest, the concern from the beginning was access, barriers that have plagued communities, especially communities of color for decades, from language, from, transportation, or even, immigration status. And so, we have found that so many of these barriers continue to manifest themselves in accessing public benefits. And so our hope, through this effort continues to be how can we interrupt and disrupt those barriers. And we have found that folks that are most trusted, those that can walk alongside and provide that technical assistance, are the folks that are really well positioned to be able to do this work.
And Maria Elena, could you describe, so Cynthia kind of laid out some of the structures or partners and who is working on this, but could you describe who you are reaching out to and how you are reaching out to those communities?
Thank you, Faye. And I think Cynthia have a big picture of how we have been doing the work in Tulsa, and the key is the collaboration with the amazing the strategy that best build in the community, GKFF best, with the different partners and organizations to address these needs. And specific, my role like community liaison for GKFF best and be part of a program called the Power of Families Project under the umbrella of Community Service. It was under the umbrella of Community Service Council. This strategy was based in a key component called community peer educators, promotoras comunitarias. These people from the community who work in the community and then below the community, they are the trust messengers, they are the connectors, they are through the network they build, they invite our community to express their concerns, their needs, their worries, or connect with the service the community provides to the access to the child tax credit, to the EBT card, all this information building in a trust relation with the empathy and culturally appropriated to understand all the issues connected with specific with this topic that we are talking about. It's through this almost 8 years building this relation in this community that we can deliver information, provide the resources, connect, for example, with Tulsa Response, that you have this free service to get your child tax credit consistently through this short time that we can access the information and provide, first of all, in Spanish, mainly the parents that speak Spanish, they feel more confident, navigate. For me, it would be wonderful to speak in Spanish too right now. I feel a little nervous and I feel to learn so much English. And this is the things how we address in our community and how they, I think is another key is how you have built relationship even with the agency or the tax provider service that you build in our community, because you have to connect with these people and share your information and provide the resources they needed. It's another piece that we have to address and how our community feel more confident, understand what is mean child tax credit. I think they have so much information we have to provide them to use these benefits, but we are working on that.
Thank you, Maria Elena. I think that trust building component is so important. And we do want to go back to asking you a little bit more about kind of annual tax returns. But quickly, Marcela, could you also tell me, you have a lot of experience working with tax returns, but could you describe what is it that your organization does in a regular year? And then what was it that you were doing this year? And what did your activities look like?
So in a regular year, we started working with our partner in Tulsa, Goodwill Industries, to file taxes because all their operations had been fully in person, but because of the pandemic, they had to add a remote branch to their operations. So that was our first year with them, was doing that. And so last season, we were able to do kind of a hybrid model where we were able to do in-person tax intake, but not actual preparation. And in addition to remote tax filing. So what was different this year over the summer is we reached out to as many people as we could and promoted our services as a navigation provider. We could do one-on-one assistance for households who had not started receiving their advance payments, and helping them go through the paperwork and submit through Get Your Tax Credit online to get those tax credits. What's different this year is that we're doing our tax preparation in person, fully, not just intake, and we're doing a lot more of it in person. And that is really for the low-income individuals. Doing in-person preparation is really where we're able to serve the community in the best way. And what has been different is we're kind of able to go back to how people did taxes before the pandemic, thankfully. And we're also taking appointments, which just makes it easier for households, makes it more similar to a paid preparer by providing some dignity and saying, this is the time that you come, you can choose when you come to see us.
That's great. And it's really helpful to understand kind of those differences. Well, back to, so Maria Elena, you were mentioning kind of the importance of building that relationship with the preparer over time. I think that there is the hope that people would get their tax refunds done without paying anyone. But could you describe more about that relationship and why someone would go to a particular tax preparer year after year?
Thank you, Faye. I think culturally, I would talk more specific with the Latino, Latinx, Hispanic community. We are so much attached to build a relationship with the person who provide a service. And do your taxes is an important task in our communities in general. And this is the way they think they have to do it with a person they feel trust, they feel confident. Even the benefits that do for free is another possibility to don't have the opportunity to access to the child credits previously to do the taxes every year. It's something they put a lot of families and say, I prefer save some money to pay someone because they know me, they know my needs, they know my family, they know where I work, they can understand, they will find a way to do the best way for me, It's something that we hear a lot because it's important to build this relationship. And maybe the great benefits don't have to pay them when you put in the scale to say, I prefer to do someone that I am trust, even I have to find the money to do this, but I would like to do for my save, for to be right, for don't make a mistake, for example, because they share immediately the information. Or sometimes with someone say they don't give me the information, they don't have the time to share me, this has happened, how means child tax credit, This is the way many concerns pop up, like, I have to return that money back, I have to save it, what I have to do it, I don't know. Maybe I have to report in the next tax season, and I probably have spent it and we don't have money to return to the IRS. Things like that, we have to consider taking care of the perspective of our community, and how maybe to build more connection with it, all these small agencies that normally build this kind of places that people can do the taxes. But this is something that we see and they share with us about this experience. And maybe they don't so much confident to use the great benefits to go someone that they don't have to pay anything.
I remember in a past conversation you mentioning there was people who would keep that money in their bank account, not necessarily to save it, but out of fear that if they didn't have it, they would have to pay it back. So it is an interesting insight. I guess I want to zoom out a little bit and just ask you all kind of going through that whole outreach process, what were some of the big picture takeaways? So what worked, what didn't, who did you reach, who didn't you reach, and kind of what are some of the things that you're thinking about moving forward?
I can get us started and then would love Marcella and Marielena to jump in. So I think some of the big picture takeaways for me is being an affirmation of the role of a navigator, especially a peer educator or promotor, someone who comes from the community who represents the folks that we're serving. I also think from like a high level at a grass tops, right, looking at the organizations that were involved, there's something I wish we could do differently in hindsight is just clarity in defining the roles and maybe solidifying partnerships earlier on. We were in a time crunch from July to November. It felt like just trying to figure out, well, how can we get this off the ground? And so it did feel like fast and furious, but I wish there was a little bit more time, to take that step back and say, okay, what can we do at a high level to further solidify these partnerships? And then the other thing that in hindsight I would say is we at the beginning really wanted to focus our campaign on newborns. We thought that was one place that we could really capitalize, especially with the birth rate strategy for Tulsa. Like, we had such a huge emphasis on preconception and birth that we had many partners in hospitals, nurses, pediatrician offices, and unfortunately that ended up not panning out. as the IRS, the non-filer portal didn't have that option to add newborns and do advance payments. And so now we're on the back end trying to figure out, well, how can we get those newborns born in 2021, like my nephew, for example, and get them back on, on the radar. And so I think there's just things like that. And then finally, I'll say I'm really excited by the referral pipeline. I think that Tulsa Response, for example, represents a really unique opportunity in our community to really think about public benefits in a very expansive way, and to have this sort of triage point where navigators can, help you with your child tax credit, but also your taxes, also Medicaid. And so there's a really critical way that a partner like Tulsa Responds and other community partners that are part of our network can really build this sort of closed loop referral process within Tulsa. So those were a few of my takeaways.
I'll build on what Cynthia was saying. We're building a lot of our operations around the tax filing process. Filing taxes is just one of the things that Tulsa Responds does, and we use it as an opportunity to find out if these households are insured, if they're participating in SNAP, if they're receiving the federal subsidies for internet. So because the VITA program, or the tax filing program, provides a financial benefit to these households, they are seeking us out for this service, and then we can use that in turn to find out more about them and then enroll them in more programs in hopes that they will achieve some financial stability. And because all these programs are incredibly difficult to enroll in, just for one of them, and so if we can hold their hand and walk them through that that whole process, then hopefully they are able to spend their time on their job or looking for daycare, all the other challenges that low-income households face without the government bureaucracy. So really trying to use the tax filing opportunity to plug them into the full depth of the social safety net. Another takeaway is that this was a very ambitious tax increase or credit increase that was done very, very quickly. And so what we saw the whole time, we were told this month they're going to add to the portal that you can add these new births, and it just never materialized, unfortunately. But they were trying to do something huge in a very short amount of time. And so where we saw issues were there was fraud. Sadly, whenever there is money being given to taxpayers or to anyone, someone is going to try to get that money that didn't earn it. So there were many instances where families were finding that their children were already being claimed. Another issue was with the households that have dual custody, and the questions around who gets to keep that tax credit. So I think the unfortunate takeaway for me is that for those who are, if it's difficult for them to get the tax credit in the first place, or any taxes, or to file their taxes in the first place, they're the ones who it was hardest to help them get this tax credit in the end. And then just from how we reach people, we found text messaging was very effective, and emails, cold calling, not as much. So we try to use text messaging as much as possible.
And maybe follow to what Marcela said and Cynthia, and I would just to maybe remark the collaboration key with trust messengers that we need to build to this work is working, even with the limitation of time, the difficult to access and Spanish the information to understand the process, the particularly of each family with different immigration status, the undocumented parents, the citizens' kids, and so many fears around that, how I am beneficial for that or no, my kids, they are or no, because with experience with the stimulus check, if the parents was undocumented or they have a mix of families, they don't have these benefits. And there was all this information they're still processing, and they generate this kind of confusion for them, it's applied to me, doesn't apply to me. even as say for kids, we have to be so aware and be really open-minded in the way how we can address the needs of this particular family and how we can collaborate in the best way. Even understand child tax credit is something that we didn't understand very well. We can address with more information about that and be simple, they can be accessible for them, and how we can keep advocating for these benefits can be more useful for our community.
Thank you all. There's so much exciting work going on in Tulsa, and it's really interesting to hear your takeaways and kind of what you're all thinking about as you go through your next steps. And yeah, so thank you all for taking the time today, and thank you all for everything that you're doing on the ground. With that, we are going to shift gears a little bit. We are now going to speak to 3 Tulsa parents who received the CTC. So I'm going to invite Fabiola Contreras, Heyli Guerra, and Cheree Brown to turn on their cameras. And so we're going to be doing something a little bit different with the setup of this. So Heyli and Fabiola are going to be providing their answers in Spanish, and then I will be translating for the audience as we go. So we're going to have a couple minutes back and forth for some of those translations. But Heyli y Fabiola, si quieren poner sus cámaras, por favor. While they are getting set up on camera, we can start.
Yo estoy.
¿Me ves?
¿Me ves?
Oh, sí. Yep. Okay, perdón. So we are, we wanted to start by just asking, how did you all hear about the new monthly CTC payments?
Hi, everyone. I'm Cheree, and I heard about the new payments just from the general media personally, from honestly the presidential speakings that he had many times last year, mainly due to the COVID responses, but also speaking at that same time about the new tax credits that were being introduced. And through social media with different news links being shared and articles, and a lot of friends and family all had, kind of speculations and questions about it. So that's the main area where I heard about it.
Fabiola, do you want to go through how you learned about it?
Hola a todos, soy Fabiola. En mi caso, bueno, yo me enteré también por las noticias, pero también recibimos unas cartas del IRS diciendo qué cantidad íbamos a recibir por cada uno de nuestros hijos y desde el mes de julio a diciembre.
So she says that she also learned from the news, but also received some notes in the mail from the IRS that laid out exactly how much they would be receiving monthly for each of their children. And Heyli?
Yo supe porque fui a recoger una hoja donde hago las taxas de mi cuñada, y ahí me dijeron, Heyli, ¿ya recibiste el dinero de tus niños? Y entonces yo le dije, ¿qué dinero? Y me dijo, lo que está dando el gobierno. Y le dije, no, ¿cuánto es? Entonces me dijeron, vete a tu banco y ahí debe estar el dinero. Y ya así es como me di cuenta, y después recibí también por correo unas notas.
So she says that she was going to where she does her tax preparations, and she was asked whether she had received that money, which she had not heard about. And so she said, no, she hadn't. And they said to go check her bank account. And when she went to check it, it had been automatically deposited into her bank account. But she also, in addition to that, also received those same letters in the mail from the IRS. Gracias. So our next question is just focused on, so did you have any difficulties in receiving the credit? Heyli, it sounds like you automatically got yours deposited, but any difficulties? If so, what were they?
I had quite a unique experience, and I feel very privileged and thankful to have the opportunity to share my experience to potentially help future Americans to have an easier experience, hopefully. And hopefully mine was a unique experience, but I doubt it because of the situation. So there's a lot of details. And so I want to make sure that everybody understands exactly what happened, so I don't miss any parts. I did take some notes to make sure that I don't miss anything, because everything is important to kind of understand the layout of the time frame. So this was one of the organizations that I reached out to in the last year to get some assistance and answers and help on my situation. So I was very thankful for that option. But my husband and I had our second daughter in August of 2020. And because of that, she did not receive any of the stimulus during that year because they were using our 2019 taxes, and she wasn't on that. So we filed our taxes like normal in February of 2021. And on there, it asked us if we had received a certain amount from the stimulus. And so it was a yes or no question. So we said yes, because we did receive that amount, but it did not have anywhere on there to list an optional, amount that we felt like we should have received because of our daughter being born and an additional dependent being added onto our taxes. So we went through our whole taxes, we used TurboTax, and then at the end, we realized it never asked us for additional stimulus options. Like we thought, oh, we'll keep going through the process, and certainly it'll ask us at some point, oh, you have a new dependent, then this is what you should receive. So at the end, we realized that it listed her as an additional other dependent and gave us the $500 credit for that instead of the $2,000 for a child tax credit from the previous year. So I contacted TurboTax, and assistance for them was on hold for 2 hours to try to get some help and walk through where I missed something. Was something missed? Was it just a flaw in the system? Something. And she walked through the whole tax return with me and found one tiny little check mark that was missed that said, because of an additional dependent being born. I'm assuming that's a very easy step for a lot of people to miss, because I'm very detailed and I missed it myself. But she advised us to wait until we get our return, to not mix anything up before we amend it and confuse anymore and delay the process. So we amended it after we got our return in March, and we did get the additional $1,500 and the child tax credit, the dependent amount, but it wasn't until October. So between March and October, I called several people for help, 1-800 numbers from the IRS, trying to just understand why my amended tax was taking so long. And I understood it said on the website, 16 weeks is the general amount because we filed online. And I understood that because of COVID, it was potentially going to take longer anyways because of, low staffing or whatever, everything was taking longer, as we all know, throughout the world. But I had never filed an amended tax return before, so I had no idea what the general process was supposed to look like. And then I was getting different feedback from a lot of the representatives. A lot of them were saying because she was born in August, she wasn't alive for at least half of the year, so she shouldn't even qualify anyways. So that was a concern. And then some people were saying, no, she definitely should qualify and you need to keep fighting for it. So I was getting very mixed signals. It seemed like a lot of people didn't really know the correct answer, and nothing was laid out black and white on the online to find out. And at one point I was so, desperate for help that I went to a local office here, even in Tulsa, and was kind of shut down because I didn't have an appointment, and I got handed a bookmark type of paper with a number saying to call at 7 a.m. to get an appointment to come back. I called and was never able to get through to even get an appointment. I couldn't even make an appointment in person to come back another time. And thankfully there was a woman that was working there that was leaving for her lunch break. And I rode down on the elevator with her and pleaded desperately for help to understand if I was in the right direction. Should I continue pursuing this? Am I wasting my time? Something, anything to help me. And she said that, yes, you're doing the right thing. Keep pursuing it. You should qualify for that. So thankfully I got a little bit of help from somebody. And let's see here. So finally, in the beginning of October, I got a hold of somebody that was helpful at the IRS, just a random 1-800 number, to check on it. And again, try to pursue this amended taxes, because at this time in October, I still had not received any of my 2021 child tax credit. And so that was a whole nother concern that was kind of being postponed and a concern for me. So they finally said that because it had been so long, I qualified for a tax advocate. And she contacted me, they got back in touch with me and finally got the process moving. Somebody was doing something to help. And so I did get the remaining refund amount in the end of October. In the meantime, during that time, I also had created an account on the child tax credit area of the website with the IRS to try to check on that process. And this is one of my biggest concerns as a parent and an educated parent. That was way too complicated of a process to have to take my picture, submit a picture of my photo ID. I mean, I understand the security. I understand needing it to be secure. I appreciate that and respect that. But I highly doubt many Americans would be able to understand and complete that process. It needs to be simplified, period. Because if I wasn't as persistent as I am personally, I would have given up on that and just said, forget it, it's too hard. So all of that to say, because I was supposed to be receiving the child tax credit in July for both of my children, and it was being postponed, month after month, and then it was eventually told to me that it was postponed because of my taxes being amended, that I finally in November received $900, in December $900 as well. But that was also a concern because that was only for one of my children. They still did not recognize that I had 2 children, another one born in August of 2020, and it's over a year later now. So we just filed our taxes for this year, 2021, this weekend. And thankfully, I am very happy to report that it should give us the other half of my older daughter's amount like normal, and the full amount of my new, youngest daughter. So we'll see. I'm holding my breath. I'm not hoping, everything's going to go just perfect because I'm, realistic, but that's what it's showing. And so that's, kind of my experience, but I am very thankful for the credit. I think it's great. I appreciate it. And it's been very helpful for my family.
Thanks for sharing that, and fingers crossed that this one goes through. Fabiola, any difficulties when you were applying for receiving the credit?
No, en nuestro caso no tuvimos ninguna dificultad. Nosotros ya teníamos registrada nuestra cuenta de banco donde nos reembolsaban pues nuestro dinero de cada año, y pues ahí nos reembolsaron los créditos de los niños también mes con mes. Nunca tuve ninguna dificultad para recibirlo.
And she says, no, in our house, there was no difficulty. We already had our bank account registered where we normally receive the reimbursements. And for this year, we just received them monthly direct to that bank account.
Pero también, bueno, quiero agregar una cosa. A mí se me hace de muy buena ayuda cuando alguien te hace los taxes, referente a lo que decía Cheree, pues me gusta porque te explican. A mí siempre me han explicado hasta cómo llenar mi W2 cuando voy a entrar a un nuevo trabajo. Me dicen cuántos dependes poner. Si quiero recibir mucho dinero a final de año, pues me orientan. Eso nadie te lo explica en ningún lado, ni siquiera en los trabajos te explican cómo llenar tu W2. Solo te dicen llénala y no sabes cuántos dependes poner. Entonces yo creo que la confianza también que te brindan las personas que te hacen los taxes, pues es bueno porque te sacan de todas las dudas que tú tienes, te ayudan, te sugieren cosas para tu bien, pues, y a mí eso me gusta. Prefiero hacerlos con alguien que hacerlos sola.
Yeah, and she said she really appreciates the value of going to someone who is preparing the taxes for you. Every time she has started a new job and had to fill out a W-2, that they've really walked her through the process of, how many dependents do you have? Why are you filling this out? And that those are answers that are really difficult to find, and that having someone who can really orient you to the whole thing and explain, this is why you're getting this money, this is why you're doing this, and really walk you through the whole process, and also explain how does this relate to your well-being, what is it that you're doing, is a really, really valuable and helpful thing to have and to do. to build with that person doing your taxes. Thank you. And Heyli, what about you? Any difficulties in receiving or applying for the credit?
No, no tuve ningún problema, pero no, como no estaba la señora que me hacía las taxas, entonces medio me explicó la secretaria y pues yo me asusté y yo lo que hice fue todos me decían que ese dinero que había recibido, que iba a haber un momento que lo teníamos que devolver. Y entonces lo que hice, pues fui a donde ellos y decirles que no lo quería recibir, pero me dijeron que ya no se podía hacer nada. Entonces le dije yo no sabía, que no me explicaron bien, pero yo tengo años haciendo las taxas ahí, pero como Fabiola, que a ella le explicaron todo, y a mí sí no me explicaron nada, no, que solo me dijeron, Heyli, recibiste tu pago, ve al banco y checa, y fui a chequear y entonces sí estaba el dinero, pero muchos me decían que tenía que devolverlo. Entonces lo que hice, lo deposité a las cuentas de mis niños y ahí se quedó, aunque sí lo necesitábamos mucho y estábamos muy agradecidos porque habían mandado, muy felices porque habían mandado ese dinero para ayuda. Nos tocó que mejor prestar en vez de usar ese dinero, porque como me decían mucho que lo íbamos a devolver. Y luego fui donde la señora que me ha hecho las taxas y les pregunté a ella, me dijo que si no calificaba, a lo mejor tenía que devolverlo, y si calificaba, que no iba a devolver nada, y si no, pues que iba a recibir un poco todavía.
¿Y había un punto donde sabías que el dinero sigue en la cuenta de sus niños o ahora sabes que no lo vas a tener que devolver?
Le estaba diciendo a María Elena que pues hace como 2 semanas fuimos a lo de las taxas y pues supe eso, y pues agarramos un dinerito para arreglar la casa, ponerle piso que necesitaba porque estaba bien dañado. Entonces eso nos sirvió, sacamos una parte de ahí, de ese dinero.
Okay, so she says that when she went to the tax preparation place, that the woman who normally does her taxes was not there, and she was speaking with the secretary, who explained to her that the payments were coming, but she also mentioned that there was the potential that she would have to return that money at some point if she potentially wasn't eligible. And so so then Heyli was nervous and said, actually, I don't want it. I don't want to receive it. But by that point, it was too late and the money had already been deposited in her account. And so what she did is that she took that money and deposited it directly into her children's account. And even though that was money that they did need and that they would have wanted, they ended up taking out a loan instead of using that money for fear of having to repay it. And so then I asked if that money was still in her children's account or whether that was money that she now felt like, was actually in her account. And Heyli said that she, just a couple of weeks ago, was talking to Maria Elena and kind of was going through the process with her. And so they have now just recently taken out some of the money from their children's account and used it to redo their floors. But up until that point, there was never any assurances like Fabiola had been given that money would be theirs and that it wouldn't be money that would be taken back. And she wasn't walked through the entirety of the process. Thank you all. That's really helpful for us to understand that. My next question is you all touched upon it a little bit, but how did the credit affect you or your family? Were you able to do anything extra with it, like help fix a floor, or did it cover any expenses or improve your well-being? And if so, how?
I'll touch a little bit on that. So whenever the credit was announced in early spring, I was currently working an online admin job, and it was just a part-time job. It wasn't a full-time or anything, but it was just to make a few extra $100 to make ends meet and provide, a little bit for my family mainly as a stay-at-home mom with my children at home. And so when this credit was announced, I was extremely excited in the summer that it would be starting and it would alleviate, a little bit of extra, pressure and fluff to potentially allow me to free up having to spend time away from my children to, get that money instead of having to work to make that extra money. And so in May, at the end of May, when my daughter was out for school for the summer, I decided to quit that job because I thought we could make it for 1 month in June, and then July, the credit would be starting. And then, as you all know now, my whole experience happened. And so we actually did not start getting any of those benefits until November. So it was a little bit of a kind of a shock and a strain. It wasn't anything tremendous. We were, thankfully able to make ends meet, but that was something that our household and family was counting on. And because I was not notified when we made our amended tax because of a mistake made, that it would be postponing all of our benefits otherwise, like the child tax credit, we didn't expect that. I had no idea. There was no communication given to me that because of you did an amended taxes, now you're going to be postponed for this benefit. So it was kind of a shock and a waiting game to find out if we would be getting it. But when we did finally get it, obviously we got, backdated the full amount. So it did help. It was great timing for Christmas and to take a little family trip. So we did benefit as well from those eventually.
Fabiola, what about you? Were there any, and how did it affect you or your family?
Bueno, en nuestro caso nos benefició bastante porque pues recibíamos ese dinero exactamente la fecha que decía y pues nuestros planes era salir de vacaciones con nuestros hijos, pero pues por la pandemia no se podía. Pero yo perdí uno de mis trabajos o tenía 2 trabajos de medio tiempo. Y pues igual nuestros ingresos bajaron a causa de que perdí un trabajo y pues ese dinero nos ayudaba bastante para solventar los gastos de la familia, pagar el pago de la casa, los biles, pues comprar comida también y pues sí nos ayudábamos bastante con ese dinero. O sea, a mí me pareció una buena idea recibir esos créditos.
So Fabiola was saying that that originally they had been hoping to go on vacation as a family, but because of the pandemic, they were unable to do that. And so she had lost one of her part-time jobs. And then the child tax credit was really helpful in kind of supplementing their income after the loss of that job. So that was money that was used to go towards house payments, that was used to go towards bills, that was used towards food. So it was really something that was a good idea, and that in her case was something that that they really utilized. Oh, and she also mentioned that it did come in exactly when they expected it to, so that having it be reliable was another reason they were able to use it. And Heyli, what about you? Oh, you're muted. Sorry. Oh, estás en no te podemos seguir, perdón.
Como les digo anteriormente, nosotros pues no ocupamos ese dinero porque por miedo que lo iban a pedir y luego dije, no vamos a tener, por lo de la pandemia, no vamos a tener dinero para pagarlo para atrás. Entonces, entonces lo que hicimos es un familiar nos prestó y de allí, pues ahorita que nos enteramos de todo eso, entonces sacamos también parte del dinero esta semana y le devolvimos a la persona que gracias a Dios no nos cobró intereses y le devolvimos los gastos porque pues nosotros agarramos casa y él nos prestó cierta cantidad para agarrar la casa de una vez para no ser por el banco y pues para la comida y todo eso. Pero no, nosotros no teníamos, esta vez sino, el año pasado, sí, por lo de la pandemia, también teníamos planes de ir de paseo, pero ya no pudimos ir por lo de la pandemia porque mi esposo también se quedó sin trabajo. Había veces que trabajaba 2 veces por semana por lo de la pandemia.
So Heyli was saying, like she mentioned before, so it was for a while that money was just sitting in her children's bank account, and they were loaned money from someone that they knew that did not charge them any interest, and they were able to use that money towards a payment on a home. And then when they took the money out just last week, they used it towards the floor. They used it to repay their friend. They had been hoping to go on vacation last year, but unfortunately weren't able to because of the pandemic. But also as a result of the pandemic, her husband was only working 2 days a week, oftentimes. So having that money to pay for food, to pay for other needs around the house was really useful. So the other question would be, do you all feel like most of your friends with children got payments? And why or why not? And how are people generally talking about the child tax credits? Were there any concerns that, I know you've all raised some of your concerns, but have you heard other people mention other concerns that weren't raised yet?
Most of my friends in the community and people that I socialize with have received the child tax credit. Some of them were a little concerned with the advance payments and that it could cause some confusion at this time for taxes, that it would, you know, how much would you be getting now? And they didn't really see the purpose of the advance payments. I personally appreciated the idea of the advance payments because I think most Americans, just in general, would be more responsible with payments paid out over time versus a big lump sum. That's just my personal opinion. But I think with the half and half with this introductory year, I think it would be, you know, it was a great idea. I think it would be great even throughout the entire year, all 12 months, just it kind of distributed out throughout the entire year to help with the things that you really need it, you know, making bills, food, extracurricular activities, things like that to assist the children, which this credit is designed to do. So there wasn't very many concerns that my community or social group had with it, and most of them did receive it.
Yo, bueno, sí conozco mucha gente que, y tengo amigos y familia también que no han recibido ningún estímulo o han recibido en partes, pero apenas este mes pasado o así, o sea, no lo recibieron como mes con mes que ellos tienen. A veces las personas les da un poco de miedo registrar su cuenta de banco porque piensan que van a robar información sobre ellos. No tanto por los hijos, pero siempre cuando la mayoría de los latinos hacemos nuestros taxes, pues la mayoría desconfían más si su estatus no es legal. Entonces, sé de muchos amigos y también de personas de la comunidad de aquí de Tulsa que no han recibido nada. Tienen la posibilidad de calificar porque tienen sus hijos nacidos aquí, son ciudadanos americanos, pero así no quieren pedir las ayudas, como en el caso de Heyli. Sé de personas que han sacado préstamos para solventar sus gastos de su casa o para comprar comida, porque no se animan a pues hacer la solicitud de que les regresen sus créditos de sus hijos por miedo a que tomen información sobre ellos o por miedo de que vayan a tener que pagar ese dinero después. Y esos son los comentarios que yo he escuchado mucho de la comunidad, que no quieren ninguna ayuda del gobierno porque aunque la necesitan, no lo piden por miedo que después de que nos gastemos el dinero, nos lo pidan de regreso.
Estuvo cortando un poquito, entonces avísame si hay algo más que no digo, pero Fabiola was saying that she knows a lot of people that didn't receive stimulus payments or that only received certain payments but not others for the CTC. But there also is a lot of fear around applying, that there are people who have mixed status families say that their children are citizens but potentially they're not, and that providing their bank account information, providing their information is something that people are reluctant or nervous or hesitant to do. And that there are also other people who don't necessarily want to ask the government for help, and that they are, even if they do really need it. And so she knows of people who have ended up taking out loans or really not having the money that they would have really needed, just because there is a lot of hesitancy or fear in applying for that or providing that information to the government at times. Había algo más, perdón, estaba cortando.
Sí, también siento que es un poco de desinformación porque nadie nos da esta información de que pues toda la información que vas a proveer, pues no corres riesgo, ¿ves? Si alguien saliera a explicarnos que no importa el estatus legal de los padres, pues así nos animaríamos a pedir las ayudas que necesitamos, porque la mayoría de la comunidad latina, hispanos, pues la verdad que sí necesitábamos de esos créditos. Sufrimos mucho durante la pandemia, ya sea por salud o económicamente, económicamente, pero económicamente creo que fue mucho más lo que padecimos todos los latinos, porque muchos perdieron su trabajo y también era muy difícil volver a encontrar otro trabajo por lo mismo de su estatus migratorio.
She says that there also is some misinformation that is going around, that there isn't necessarily someone that is going around and saying your citizenship or your legal status doesn't matter in this case, that that's not what people are looking for. And that if more people were aware of that, there would be more people who would be excited and willing to apply. And that particularly during that in the context of the Latino community, that the Latino community has been really hard hit by COVID. Whether it be in terms of health or economically, a lot of people have lost their jobs, and as a result of their legal status, are also not having difficulty in finding new jobs. So that money would be appreciated, and that money would be helpful. But there's not necessarily anyone going and saying, "Here's how you apply, and here's how they keep that information safe, and here's why you should trust it." And Heyli, what about you? What are you hearing from friends?
Sí, muchos familiares y amigos también no recibieron nada. Hasta el momento tengo una amiga que ella dice que no recibió nada, 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 y que a lo mejor es porque ella está arreglando papeles y dice que no quiere tener problemas y pues tampoco que después le tocara que pagar. Mi cuñada también no calificó, dice que no le llegó nada porque tiene un niño que es nacido en Guatemala y la otra niña acá, pero dice que por un papel y que por eso no le dieron nada. Y otra amiga que porque tenía que renovar el fiscal y le perdieron su pasaporte y todo y pues no recibió nadita tampoco y le dijeron que era demasiado tarde, que yo no sé, o sea, no recibió nada el año pasado y ya no sé si este año.
So she said that she's had friends who haven't received anything at all, that she has one friend, for example, that was in the process of getting her papers together and that she didn't receive anything. And even though she was eligible, she didn't necessarily want to go applying for that in case it would cause any issues in her application. She also knows that her sister-in-law, for example, is also eligible but did not receive it. So there are people who really are eligible, but for one reason or another have difficulty applying, or even when they do apply, don't necessarily receive it.
Otra pregunta, pregunta que quería hacer es que también nos dijeron a nosotros que depende lo que gane también, si es mucho y pues no recibe nada uno, dice, y otra amiga no recibió nada porque ella siempre le toca que pagar, dice, porque trabaja el esposo y trabaja ella, entonces por eso dice que tampoco ellos no recibieron absolutamente nada, les tocó que pagar.
Para sus impuestos les tocó de pagar.
Sí, le tocó que pagar y tiene 4 niños y les tocó que pagar porque le dijeron que ganaba mucho ella y el esposo.
So she also has another friend who her and her husband both work, but then when they went to apply, they were told that they owed money because they earned too much. So there are it seems like we're hearing a lot of different cases of people hearing different things. And I guess that would be, so in terms of my last question, I would ask, if you were designing a program like this, how would you make sure that everyone got the credit, that people knew that they were eligible, knew how to apply? How would you make sure that this reached the people that need it the most?
Well, I think it's extremely complicated, especially for the first year of any implementation of a new policy or credit. I am not a specialist on this and don't have any official ideas by any means, but just as a regular citizen, I would say that most people in my social group refer to social media like Facebook and things like that to get their source of news and things going on in the world. Personally, and unfortunately, most of my generation, I feel like don't really watch the news. That's just my personal perception. And we reach out to social media to see things that are going on. And if there was a way to design some kind of a short clip through either YouTube or something that was animated would catch people's attention to explain the process, explain the details as best as possible about the credit, and maybe answer some of the concerns that showed up this year. It could reach mass people, and it could be shared, and it could kind of reach a lot of people and be out there for the public to understand more, versus just in the primary media and news and in formats that may not be where people understand it, with, you know, vocabulary that may not be understandable by them. And of course, and, you know, bilingual would help as well. And also just kind of brainstorming, thinking about ideas. Schools are obviously where most of the parents are at most of the time, because they have children there, and that's where you can reach a lot of parents that would be taking advantage of this. So I don't know if there's a resource in the schools that could somehow be there to answer questions, or I don't know if I know there's obviously lots of schools, but something through the schools to reach the parents, because that's the best way, I feel like, to reach the people, the population that needs to understand more about this with the children at that age, to get out to them. I don't know if somebody could be there to answer questions in person at schools, or just even a flyer to go home with the children about it. That's just an idea, random. I don't even know if it's possible, but that would be something that I could potentially benefit from in my community as well.
¿Yo? ¿Yo? Sí. Bueno, en mi opinión, yo digo que independientemente del estatus legal de los padres, yo digo que todos los niños con edad escolar, ya sea desde que están en el preescolar hasta que están en la high school, deberían de recibir un pago o un crédito, porque pues quién dice que un niño que tiene documentos y un niño que no tiene documentos no está sufriendo o no está padeciendo la pandemia. Entonces, pues yo digo que todos los padres trabajamos duro, o sea, con documentos o sin documentos, pero trabajamos, todos pagamos impuestos, y entonces creo que la manera más justa de que se distribuyan esos créditos para los hijos es que todos los niños en edad escolar reciban crédito.
She says that the thing that would be most fair would be to make sure that all school-age children from pre-K all the way through high school are eligible, regardless of the status, are eligible for that money, because all parents are working hard. They are trying to make ends meet. And why should a child who is documented be provided with more support than a child who is undocumented? And that the fairest way would just be to make sure that all school-age children are eligible for and receiving that credit. Heyli?
Yo pienso igual que Fabiola, que todos los niños que están estudiando y los padres luchan mucho, tienen derecho a recibir ese dinero mientras estén estudiando, sean niños, porque hay niños que son muy, muy estudiosos y pues también se enferman, padecen de todas enfermedades, y los papás, yo me incluyo yo, porque digo yo, ellos no tienen, o sea, no tienen un seguro para su medicina, para el hospital, y pues los papás trabajan muy duro para poder darle lo mejor. Y entonces yo siento que también los niños que no son nacidos acá, pero que están estudiando, tienen todo el derecho de recibir ese dinero. Y antes, cuando se hacían las taxas, los niños que no eran nacidos acá recibían, de otros países, recibían el pago de las taxas, y ya de lo de 2 o 3 años antes ya no hicieron eso, ya los niños no recibieron ni lo de las taxas, ni pues nada de lo del gobierno, y pues tienen derecho a recibir como los niños nacidos acá.
Heyli said that she's in agreement with Fabiola, that their parents are working really hard to make ends meet, and that all children in school should be receiving that, and that it isn't just that a child could be in school, could get sick, and that if they don't have insurance, that the parents would have difficulty paying for their medicine, and that up until a couple of years ago, it was possible to have a child who is born outside of the country and still have them receive benefits, but that within the past couple of years, that has been made more difficult. And so making sure that all children, regardless of where they were born, regardless of their documentation status, should be eligible and should be receiving that credit. Those are all the questions that we had for you all. We really appreciate you all sharing your perspectives and speaking to your experiences and really the challenges that face you as parents and the challenges that faced you in receiving and utilizing this credit and what a just and fair system would look like to you all. So thank you all so much for taking the time and for sharing your experiences with us today. We are going to switch gears and to speak a little bit more about kind of the future of cash transfers and the policy implications of the CTC. So we are going to be joined by Elaine Mag from the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, Stephen Nunez from the Jain Family Institute, and Brian Rosa Rodriguez from Unidos US. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Faye, and thanks to everyone who has already spoken today. I know I've learned a lot. I wanted to take this opportunity to sort of allow people to reflect a little bit about what we just heard. And one of the things I wanted to bring out is that we have a serious coordination problem, and that coordination problem prevents people who have already jumped through a lot of hoops to, sort of get in the system to actually get all the benefits they're eligible for. And we saw that, in Cheree's remarks, we saw that in Cynthia's remarks. And so that, really stuck out to me. And the other thing that stuck out to me is just, even coordinating between SSA and IRS. It strikes me that, a child being born is like one of those moments where the government and parents actually interact, usually getting a Social Security number. And, the IRS and Social Security already have, communication channels. And then, why those communication channels couldn't facilitate delivering this credit to newborns or children even born the prior year, is a little disappointing. I wondered if Stephen or Brian wanted to comment on sort of things they've picked up on as well.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, one of the big terms of the last few years is administrative burden, which is also the name of a book by Pamela Hurd and Don Moynihan. And the idea that in the United States, as a policy choice, we've placed the burden of getting benefits, of applying for benefits, of proving that you're eligible for benefits entirely or almost entirely on the potential recipient. And that means that they have to jump through an enormous number of hoops to show that they are eligible, that they receive, that they're, depending on the benefit, that they are carrying out the things that they need to carry out, that they're working every month or so forth. They have to provide ID and monthly check-ins and all sorts of things. And one of the benefits, of people that people point to when you talk about something like a guaranteed income, something that's universal or near universal for a class of individuals, is that it's supposed to be much more automatic than that you're just supposed to receive it and you're not supposed to have to do that kind of legwork. But as we've seen, we have a system that wasn't set up for that. And this is in no way to say anything negative about the folks at the IRS who really, I think, did a heroic job trying to implement something with machinery, I think, that wasn't meant for it, right? They were not in the business of sending out monthly checks regularly. They're in the business of receiving funds, not dishing them out. And suddenly they had to deal with this, including a program that no longer had a work requirement and therefore no longer needed like a full tax return. So they had to set up a system to get at all those folks who don't typically file or hadn't filed recently. And it's also, I guess, not a surprise then that that there's a lot of misunderstanding about this in the community and also among sort of people who do tax prep, right? This idea you might have to pay this back makes a lot of sense if you're in a heavily means tested environment where, you know, there's a very steep benefits cliff, and it turns out, oops, I earned a little bit too much money, now I'm gonna have to pay it back. It didn't for this program, because this program had the phase out didn't really begin till over $100,000 if you were a sort of the head of household filer, $50,000 if you were a married filer. So the idea that you know, people might be concerned that they have to pay it back, or concerned they didn't earn enough money or it's not for them. I mean, that makes sense because that's the way the government has worked in the past. So I think there was a lot of learning by doing. I think they did a pretty good job given the tools that they had. You have to also remember that the IRS was just for many, many years horribly underfunded, and was basically left without the sort of machinery it needed to even do its typical job. That's starting to change now, especially with I think the last couple of weeks, there was an omnibus bill that was passed that's going to sort of inject a lot more funding into the IRS. But yeah, I would love to see a world where we have much more automatic benefits, and that we do a lot of the legwork for people. You know, why, like, as you said, when a child is born in the hospital, they bring you the paperwork to sign up for a Social Security number. Why couldn't the child tax credit be part of that process? I think it could be, but it's something that would need to be built on going forward.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen, for summarizing that. I took notes as I heard the other panelists speak. And I have three things that I think were very important for me as I heard them talk through their experiences. And the first thing I'll say is the child tax credit policy design. One of the things that also did is it expanded the credit for people in Puerto Rico, which is, I think, a huge thing that cannot be understated. It's something that it has been fought for years. And in Puerto Rico, the child poverty rate is almost close to 6 out of 10 kids. And this program was not available to them up until the passage of the American Rescue Plan. And then also in terms of the policy design, what Heyli and Fabiola were mentioning is this idea of one of the things that it missed was restoring eligibility for kids with ITIN. It doesn't make any sense for children in a mixed status household, in particular those who have ITIN numbers, who have gone through the process, who are in a household who are providing information to the IRS already, for them not to receive this benefit at a time in which we had a global pandemic, and their parents were missing out on the ability to work and provide for their health and food and services. But I think that's one of the things that in terms of the policy design, there was one extra thing that it got right. It restored eligibility for kids in Puerto Rico, but it failed to do one of the biggest things for immigrant families, which is restore eligibility for kids with ITIN. The other part that I heard from the panel is it was really important, and it's kind of also similar to what Stephen and Elaine were mentioning, is this ability of collaboration that the IRS seems to be, it's a skill that it seems to be missing or not fully fleshed, developed. It's a muscle that it still needs to exercise more, and not only across agencies, but also across community-based organizations. I'm thinking about the organizations that Heyli and Fabiola mentioned that they would reach out to for information, or you know, where folks will have to oftentimes interact with the tax system is through a community-based organization. So their ability to leverage the social capital of these CBOs as they roll out a massive program like this was a missed opportunity in many cases. And a lot of us, I'm speaking for Unidos US and also many other organizations, have taken up on themselves with private dollars to really support the implementation of the child tax credit, because we believe in this policy and we believe on the impact that it provides for many people. And then the other thing that I want to highlight is the way that the families that we saw here and we heard from today, the way that they use the money to invest in their future and in their ability to cope with the pandemic. You know, we heard that they were using money for vacation, maybe also trying to have some time off, but also, you know, to put food on the table, to supplement salaries for losing a job or not being able to work full time. House repairs, these are all things that are very important. And I think another highlight that I want to bring here is that a lot of people, this is also the case for a lot of people, the opportunity cost of working versus taking care of your kid. This is something that we saw from the panelists, that they were able to take time off work so they can focus on providing for their children. So I think it's a really important aspect of this credit and of this policy. And I want to stop there because I know we have many, many other things that we want to talk through.
So one of the things that strikes me is we implement a program and it takes some time for people to learn about it. And, you know, there's research out there that shows over time, we see take-up rates increase of various programs as people move into neighborhoods, you know, sort of reflecting what people are saying. You hear from a friend or a family about a particular program, and you might, you know, then trust it and take benefits up. When the government turns programs on and off, like it's doing with the child tax credit, some people might say, you know, that's a really important function for the government. They were trying to deliver targeted aid during the pandemic. And so it really was intended just to be a limited program. But it strikes me that that really is like taking us backwards if we want to actually establish some kind of long-term support. And I was interested in both of your thoughts about what responsibility does the government have to provide benefits that are reliable and consistent versus flexible and just meeting an instant perceived need?
Do you want to
So
go
I
first,
mean,
Steven? Yeah.
Sure. So I mean, the stimulus checks and so forth, obviously that was important because we're in the middle of what could have been a massive recession. And I think in a lot of ways we showed that the government can step up and get a lot of money into people's hands very quickly. And you can see that we have bounced back much more quickly than we did after the Great Recession. But there has been, as you mentioned at the beginning of this program, a long-standing issue with a very high child poverty rate in the United States relative to the other industrialized nations, and we know why. We know because the cash is not available for kids, right? We have a work condition safety net. When you have a work condition safety net where your cash comes from things like the earned income tax credit, things get particularly bad during recessions because people aren't working, right? So this was an opportunity to do something that other countries have done before in some form or another, a child allowance. And as you said, we know that that this pays off in the long run. Children grow up to be healthier and happier and more productive, less likely to have criminal justice involvement, more likely to be, taxpayers. It's just sort of a no-brainer even from that calculus. And I think, defaulting back to where we're now at, the child tax credit under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act sort of benefits, which themselves are potentially likely to expire in 2026 and throw even more turmoil into the system, means again putting a large barrier in front of the people, in front of the families that most need that benefit, and the children who would gain the most from having received that aid. It's essentially saying your aid is contingent on things that are not completely outside of your control, but oftentimes completely outside of the control of the parent, whether they're a good parent or a bad parent. So I think it's quite disappointing to see that we had done all of this work, that we had built a basis, a foundation where we could continue to build on it and get those, participation rates up to close to 100% over time as people learned from the system and as we sort of tweaked it and streamlined it and learning by doing. And now, that's in jeopardy. We could go back, we could tweak the system that we currently have, and it doesn't have to be, the phase out or the phase in that we have, starting at $2,500 and so forth. But it's really getting rid of that phase-in that's doing sort of the lion's share of the work in combating poverty, and having some kind of money available for the least fortunate, I think is really key going forward. And again, it's not a radical thing. It's something that, you know, Canada does, you know, that hotbed of radical thought, Canada. So you know, it's disappointing to see that we're this close, and there's just a sort of a core contingent of people who, for some sort of deservingness reasons or some kind of you know, outdated frame, are really just sticking to this idea that there has to be a work requirement. And and a work requirement means even people who are working are going to have more difficulty getting the benefit, because they're going to have to prove that they're working and provide forms and so forth. And we know that that limits take up. So it's administratively a tragedy as well.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think, you know, the fact that we've tied this expansion of the CTC to the policy window that this pandemic opened does not mean that the need for a cash benefit policy like this one in non-pandemic years, it's not important. I think the same families that were struggling before the pandemic are, you know, were hard hit throughout the pandemic. And if we restore things to where they were before, they're going to continue to struggle. So I think, you know, when people describe, you know, economic recovery, I always like to add the word equitable in there. So it's an equitable economic recovery. So that means to me that we're not just helping children that because of the economic shift went down into deep poverty and restore them down to like regular poverty or near poverty, right? I'm thinking about a policy that would lift everyone up and provide these families with the economic mobility that they need to make us all stronger and better. So, you know, and this is something that we've heard from folks before, like US social policy has increasingly stratified also in the case of immigrants. They stratify immigrants by legality, you know, extending eligibility and exclusion, benefits, limitations, and administrative burdens, not only to undocumented immigrants, like we've heard from Fabiola and Heyli, but also to lawful permanent residents of the US that are in immigrant families. So this type of stratification of people and changing in the rules up and down, left and right, I think makes it for a very faulty policy in terms of the impact. So when we want to think about economic mobility and sustainability of these families, when we think about helping those who are fighting back from the pandemic, we really need to think about economic mobility as a case of the goal, the policy goal that we should achieve, or we try to achieve through this policy. And the way we do that is to make those elements and make the policy equitable, impactful, to be permanent, like the full refundability nature of this credit, and also restoring eligibility, like we heard today, for those kids who are with an ITIN number and don't have a valid social security number yet. So I think those are important key aspects of the policy that need to continue in order to drive the equitable impact of the CTC.
So I want to close before I invite everyone else back with your wish list. I want to know, what are the 3 characteristics of a cash program, a child tax credit, or a child allowance that you think are really essential to make the program a success? And I'll add mine after I hear from both of you.
I mean, I think it has to be, I mean, absolutely has to be unconditional. It cannot be conditioned on work. That's leaving too much up to the vagaries of fate. I think we need to invest a lot if we're going to do this, whether we do this as part of the Social Security Administration, as some people have talked about, or in the IRS. We need to invest a lot in creating, you know, an administrative pipeline, like you know, a government to pocket pipeline, right? And I think that means also dealing with things like the unbanked population, folks who don't have access to direct deposit. I've often said things like public banking go very nicely with the idea of having a cash disbursement system. You know, from the federal government, whether it be Fed accounts or postal banking or whatever, to reach communities where there aren't brick and mortar places, or where people for very good reason, don't trust or can't really access commercial banks. And I guess just also, it just needs to be more generous. I think our safety net is pretty threadbare. Even when it comes to the populations that we supposedly focus on, children and the elderly and so forth, we could do better. I would also like us to open up a conversation about, say, able-bodied adults without children who really get nothing or almost nothing from our government. But at least in the meantime, you know, if we can tackle child poverty, we're already doing a huge amount of work. And I will say, by the way, that you know, Jain Family Institute has done some analyses of you know, who benefits from these different systems. And the switch back, I was just looking over this a few minutes ago, the switch back to a system where you have to earn at least $2,500 and there's a sort of a gradual phase in of the benefit, hurts Oklahoma specifically the worst. It happens to be the state that where the people, you know, the poor in the state are sort of right on the income distribution in a place where it really, really harms them. And I think my colleague can share the link to that. We've done a state-by-state analysis. Obviously, nobody is benefiting from this sort of flip back to the status quo ex ante. But Oklahoma in particular suffers, and I thought that was a sort of an odd but appropriate you know, factoid to add given the conversation today. So I'll stop.
Great. I'll be quick. I think, you know, given what we heard also, I think I'm reaffirming in saying that we need, whether we choose that we were going to stay with the tax system as a way to disperse this funding, we need a culturally competent outreach strategy. It needs to involve, you know, across agency and include those with the social capital to really make these programs work, and that includes community-based organizations. So that's something that needs to happen. The other part is, like, you know, Stephen mentioned, it needs to be universal. It needs to be available for everyone. So that means completely fully refundable, restoring eligibility of kids that have ITINs, and also making sure that people that live in the territories in Puerto Rico have the same level of benefits as everyone else. And then it has to be generous. It has to be big enough so that families can benefit from it and really start building on a foundation that could lift them up out of poverty, not only throughout the pandemic or for 1 year or 2 years. It has to be something that needs to be done permanently.
Thanks. As everyone else turns their camera back on, if they'd like, we have a few more questions. I'll just add, you know, on my wish list is, first off, echoing what you all have said, that the credit be fully refundable. That is, that the lowest income families get the maximum benefit. I think we ought to design child policy that focuses on children and not necessarily on what their parents are doing. The second thing I'd like is agency coordination. So we have to use all the information we have and distribute these credits fairly. And the third thing I want is a program that doesn't change year to year, so that families don't have the burden of trying to figure out what the government's going to do, but they can rely on and know what's going to happen. I'm going to turn it over. I think Faye got some questions before when we sent out the invitation. And also we've had a few questions in the chat that she'll lift up. And Faye, you can either call on a particular person, or we can just sort of give a little clue if you want to answer it for all the folks joining.
Yeah, I can pull a couple of the ones that we received earlier from the registration. So one question is, what do we know about the sources of funding for advocacy efforts and public information campaigns, and the general outreach to encourage tax filing among low-income families who had not formally received the CTC? So were information campaigns publicly funded, privately funded? What did those look like across the country?
So I thought it was really interesting that people actually opened that letter up from the IRS that said the child tax credit is coming, because myself, when I receive IRS mail, and this is true even when I was an employee, I kind of gasped and set some of that aside. So there was certainly some productive public funding that went into this. And, you know, we heard stories about people hearing it on the news as well. But maybe Cynthia probably has some perspective, as she was one of the folks running sort of a private campaign too.
Yeah, so, and this is a place where, you know, I think private philanthropy can support, you know, in unique ways, right? In Tulsa, one of the things we did is we actually worked with a Oklahoma-based communications firm, especially in the month of November, to drive earned media about the deadline and connect Tulsa Response, the Financial Empowerment Center, which provided one-on-one financial counseling. And so that was our role, was sort of coordination, funding, providing the resource for it, but also, you know, being able to leverage our connections with communications and media to ensure that the word was out there. Nationally, we also were able to get a lot of materials from Urban Institute, but also GMMB and SKDK. They did some really awesome daily child tax credit daily digest. So every day we would get, you know, what was on the news, what were some of the poll numbers, what was on Twitter, those sorts of things. And they would also coordinate some storytelling from hyper local stories and really elevate them nationally.
Yeah, I can also add to that answer. I think it took an ecosystem of different partners to elevate awareness around the credit. I think some of the most effective ways that we at Unidos have been able to collaborate in hyper-localized efforts like in Puerto Rico and also at a more national level is, yes, using all the available resources from partners, but also engaging the agency, Treasury, also engaging folks in the White House and the American Rescue Plan team, engaging also state and local officials and folks who have access to lists of families and are able to really just connect us with that group of people. And I think also it takes a lot of thinking. You know, the vast majority of people, like we heard from Fabiola and Heyli, got their advance payments directly, but a bunch of people just didn't. So I think it requires a lot of hard work. Your regular TV ad is not going to make it. It's not going to make it to them, right? It requires a lot of navigator training. So I commend all the work that Maria Elena and folks did to make sure that happened, because I think that's how you get to the last mile of folks, is through very innovative hands-on work, leveraging the social capital of community-based organizations.
We've got another question. I think this one is for Fabiola and Heyli. Mencionaron que perdieron empleo, pudieron solicitar y recibir seguro de desempleo. So it's about whether they received unemployment insurance when they did lose their jobs.
No, yo continué con mi otro trabajo. Yo trabajaba en un hotel por part-time en la noche y de día trabajaba en una guardería. Entonces, pues seguí con la guardería y mi esposo es jardinero, so él continuó trabajando full-time de jardinero, pero yo nunca solicité desempleo.
She says no.
Una de las cosas también, perdón. Una de las cosas que nos ayudó también fue porque recibimos las primeras tarjetas que mandaron sobre PBT, que era el dinero para los niños, para la comida. Eso también ayudaba bastante, pero yo no solicité desempleo.
So she says no, she was working part-time at night at a hotel and during the day at a daycare. And when she lost the one part-time job, she didn't apply for unemployment. Her husband continued to work full-time as a gardener, but what they did receive is they received the TEBT, and that was really helpful. Heyli, what about you?
Yo también, pues nos cayó del cielo, más bien el dinero de las tarjetas nos cayó del cielo porque pues mi esposo se había quedado sin trabajo. Entonces, una amiga me dijo, Heyli, checa tu tarjeta. Y le digo, no, sí he estado checando a ver si volvieron a poner dinero. Y entonces cuando chequé con la sorpresa que sí había dinero en las tarjetas de mis dos niñas. Y pues... pero mi esposo tampoco solicitó el desempleo, pero gracias a Dios siguió trabajando con otro señor y pues ahorita ha estado trabajando. Por lo de también ellos cuando está así el clima que está lloviendo o está muy frío o por lo de la nieve, también hay días que no trabajan, o sea, 3, 4 días, 2 días a la semana trabajan cuando el tiempo está malo también.
So she says that when her husband lost his job, he also didn't apply for unemployment, but the TEBT cards were really a surprise that kind of came out of nowhere that were really helpful. So a friend told her to check her account, and sure enough, she looked and the money she had received the money, but her husband, after he lost his job, has been working with someone else, but that job is really dependent on the weather. So there are days when it's cold or when it's raining where he is only able to work 2 to 3 days a week, but they haven't used that unemployment insurance or applied for.
So I just wanted to add, this sort of picks up on one of those threads that we heard about, how our safety net is not really a comprehensive program, right? You see people losing their job, they're not getting unemployment benefits. Similarly, we know people are eligible for SNAP benefits, but hurdles prevent them from getting the benefits. And so I think this is one of the dreams of cash assistance, is that it can provide, a better foundation for people instead of relying on a life event to trigger a program that may or may not have benefits or may not be ready to deliver those benefits at any given time.
Just to build on that, right? The unemployment insurance is, it's crucial, but it's also provided by the states. The states have an enormous amount of leeway in terms of what they do with it. Some like Florida will offer you 13 weeks of unemployment. Others 26. The replacement rates are very different, and some of them have horribly clunky systems that make it very difficult to get aid. Sometimes intentionally so. So something like the child tax credit is something that's federal. It goes out to everybody. The federal government has direct control over it. I think a lot of advocates, even now, when we talk about the Build Back Better plan, is there some way to get it back, back going? Are saying, well, okay, even if we had to do a smaller package, the child tax credit should probably be the way forward. Not because these other programs like childcare and paid leave and pre-K and so forth are not valuable, but rather that they're very difficult to implement, especially when they rely on states taking money and essentially responding to the carrots and sticks of the federal government to implement it in a way that you like to see it, right? This is something that, given the challenges of federalism, theoretically sending checks to everybody requires the least state capacity, even as we've, I guess, seen that even so, there's still major challenges to doing it.
So I think we've got one more question, and then I will pass it over to Mary Bogle for a couple of closeout thoughts. But my question is, I'll direct it at Maria Elena, but I think it's also open to anyone. But I guess I wonder, do you think that it makes sense for the IRS to be administering the CTC, or would it make sense for another agency to be running the program? Or what is your insight as to kind of the entity administering the program itself?
I think I am taking the words that Brian shared with us, what is more connected with the community-based organizations and is addressed by the community, I think would be more efficient. Maybe we can find a way to do hybrid in some way, to be more cultural in the context for everyone. We see the experience of Cheree, for example, who have apparently and the knowledgeable to do easily how difficult it is for her to access these benefits, and how the mediation of a trust person can build the capacity that the two of the members of our community have access, but it means cost, but it means relationship, and it means another way to get these benefits, and how we can build both in the same way that it address all the diversity in our community. I think was kind of my suggestion in this case. Mhm.
And I can also add a little bit to that too. I think, the folks at the IRS have done, a tremendous amount of work. If you know anyone in the IRS personally, buy them lunch and give them a hug. It's been very stressful and a lot of work over the last couple of months. But I will say this, is that, the access of collaboration between the IRS and community-based organizations is the key part here, I think. And a lot of us that work in the nonprofit sector, we carry the water between those two entities oftentimes. And I think it's important for them to build that muscle. It's something that can be done. If we're gonna keep asking the tax system to provide to us in this way, this is something that should be a requirement. We should lead with equity, not only in the policy design, but making it fully refundable and making it also accessible for kids with ITIN. But we should also lead with equity in the implementation of the policy by the same token of having a competent outreach that includes language issues, that includes navigators, trusted partners, that includes also enough funding for the correct outreach. And I think that those are the things that are going to make this policy even more impactful, in particular in those communities where they're like newly eligible for the credit and they need this hand holding or support for them to go through the whole process.
I think there were certainly proposals, including, say, Senator Mitt Romney's proposal to use the Social Security Administration to set out benefits, and that makes sense because that's what they do. They send out benefits, including monthly. They have a lot of experience doing that. But as Elaine noted, even if we were going to do this through the Social Security Administration, we would have to have much better coordination and communication between the IRS and the Social Security Administration. It's not going to solve the problem by simply handing it over to them and say, here, you guys do this, right? But so on some level, I'm kind of ambivalent about where it is hosted. At the same time, I recognize that wherever it's hosted, we need to build the infrastructure to do it. And for example, some things that the Social Security Administration does, like using direct express, like prepaid debit cards to get money to people if they don't have direct deposit on file, seems like a good idea for the IRS going forward in these sorts of benefits. And there was a time last year or 2 years ago now, where the IRS was given essentially special dispensation to use that system to get some of the stimulus checks out. And you could see that the IRS, if they are going to host this program, or if we're going to build it off of the IRS, has a lot that they could learn and implement from Social Security Administration going forward. So, the IRS can do this, but it's got to become, not just, primarily about like taking in revenue, but also about distributing benefits. And that's a new job for them, but I do think that's something that they can do if they're given the tools to do it. So I'm comfortable with it being the IRS, assuming that the necessary reforms to do so go forward are put into place going forward.
And before I pass it off to Mary, I just want to take one more opportunity and thank you all for joining us. And also just if there's any closing thoughts, particularly or Marcella, Cheree, but any of the participants, There's anything that we missed that we feel like is important before I pass it over to Mary, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'll just say, I think that one of the places where we miss a lot of people is that if you don't make enough to owe taxes, you don't have to file. And so we estimated that 2 years ago, about approximately 20% of Tulsans weren't filing their taxes. And that when you're using previous tax returns to decide who gets stimulus checks and child tax credits, you create a huge problem. And the very people that both of those things were designed to really help were the very people that were in large part missing out. And that would take so much funding to enforce that everyone has to file, but that if we were to just create a magic wand, that would be mine.
Also like to add, there seems to be, and this is just, again, my own personal experience, but a lot of assistance and outreach to culturally diverse populations. And coming from a less culturally diverse population, it feels like it's not as equal of an outreach and need of assistance and help to answer simple questions. And there's still a need for every American, especially when there's a new policy being introduced, for anybody like myself that has a hiccup or something missed or simple, that may be using their own software, TurboTax, to file their own taxes because they would have to pay somebody because they don't qualify for free taxes to be done, to go to somebody to take advantage. And it costs a lot more when you go to somebody to file your taxes when you don't qualify for them to be completed free. So you decide to do it at home yourself, and then you run into an issue with something new that you never experienced. And like myself, my husband and I for several years have used TurboTax and never had an issue, never had to amend, and it was just fine. But with this new policy being introduced, it was, something new that we didn't know. And so we ran into an issue, but I think outreach for all, populations and communities would be definitely helpful as well.
Thank you all. It has been so valuable to hear all of your perspectives, and we really appreciate all the work that all of you all are doing and you all taking the time today. With that, I will pass it over to Mary, who has a couple of closeout thoughts.
Well, when we started talking as a cash consortium, some of the partners on this phone, I think it was this kind of conversation that we were most hoping for, because I want to thank all the panelists, but especially the folks, the parents from Tulsa. I just think hearing your experiences directly takes what is, frankly, I'm a policy wonk, and often I'm lost in these conversations, and it takes what are very complex topics and puts a human face on them so people can really understand why certain shifts in policy, the time has come. I mean, I talk all the time from my standpoint in the cash-based social policy world about modernizing the safety net. But I think there's a modernization that needs to happen across all ways that government helps, because this conversation really exposes a great irony, I think, in almost all American policy designed to help citizens and residents of this country. Underlying all the red tape and all the obstacles we heard about today, obstacles which, by the way, are ameliorated only by the great work of groups like Tulsa Responds and Community Services Council that Maria Elena and Marcella represent. But underlying all this is this fear that the American taxpayer will be cheated by folks who don't want to work, will use the help fraudulently, or who shouldn't get it for some other reason. This fear and the damaging stigma that underlie it hurt us all. Basically, what we know is that, particularly for people of color, but really for anybody in this country, these stigmas hold us back from unleashing the power of more streamlined, more streamlined policy could do for folks. And we know that these damaging tropes just aren't true. The chief data tracker for Mayors for Guaranteed Income has made it clear that the folks who spend the cash from guaranteed income spend it on their needs, and then less than 1% goes to so-called temptation goods. We also see that the folks who joined us today are all from very hardworking households. And indeed, we know from various policy studies that even food stamp recipients, 70% of them work full-time. The average American doesn't even understand that fact. And yet right there, we have exposed income inequality because they're working in jobs like big box stores or fast food restaurants that just do not make the ends meet. And so you can work full time and still be on food stamps in this country. And that's a tragedy and it's an irony. So I will say that the reason many folks are converting to cash is that it is just simpler. It cuts out the red tape and streamlines the help we should provide to great families like we heard about today more equitably. And the return on this investment to boosting child well-being and adult participation in the labor market, I think if you look at the data, would be so large, it would fly in the face of all these false concerns that something like an expanded child tax credit would be used in a way that isn't worth it. In fact, I think the American taxpayers would be as benefited in receiving as in giving the help in a better way. So, and I think I hope that the lessons of the child tax credit, as erstwhile as it has been so far, we'll hold out hope, will carry on in that direction. So again, I want to thank everybody today and wish everybody well who's joined us for this conversation. Always great to have folks at the Urban Institute and to see the work of our partner, JFI, as well. So thank you all, and many thanks to Cynthia and others for joining us today and for the great work they do. Bye-bye.